All right, it's 3:45. Let's get this started on time. My name's Don Iveson. I'm the co-chair of the board for the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. I just want to say thank you for choosing to be with us for this conference on behalf of the organization, and thank you this afternoon for choosing the Scaling What Works session, Tools and Models to Grow Community-Led Housing. We'll acknowledge again that today's event is being held on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanakana Nation, recognizes the custodians of the land here today in Tiohtià:ke, now known as Montreal. So we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and the ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples from coast to coast to coast while we do this work. So we don't have simultaneous interpretation for this session, désolé, but the sessions will be available for download, the presentations will be available for download if you're interested. The way today is going to work is actually you've got two sessions for the price of one. We're going to have a presentation first from Elliston Community Builders, from Ashwin and Ewan, who you'll hear from in a moment. And then once they're complete, Alina McKay from the Housing Research Collaborative at UBC will come up and introduce an extensive panel of folks who are part of the Balanced Supply of Housing Research Initiative. And she'll introduce her colleagues based on who makes it here in time for the second half of the panel. But there are a number of them, and they're excellent, and I look forward to hearing from all of them. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ash and Ewan from Elliston. Welcome.
Thanks, Don. Oh, you don't need to stand for the whole thing. I'll call you up here. Hi, everybody. Awesome. I don't see any tomatoes in the crowd, so I'm glad. Like Don mentioned, my name's Ash. I'm with Elliston Community Builders. So I'm hoping most of you have probably heard of Elliston, the big construction company, in some way, shape, or form over at some point. The team that I help lead is actually a smaller team. Our team is specifically focused on affordable and supportive housing. Is myself and a few others that started the group about 5 years ago. We each had our own sort of personal story with housing. And we all worked in infrastructure, so developing hospitals, courthouses, LRTs, that sort of thing. And we just saw that, there was a lot of scale in infrastructure that we thought made a lot of sense in housing as well, especially non-market housing, so housing owned by nonprofits, First Nations, and governments. And so we started our group, and over the last 5 years, we've mainly worked with nonprofits, First Nations, governments on advancing their projects from kind of vision to reality. We've developed a few ourselves, especially when it looks like infrastructure. But by and large, we've worked with mainly non-market housing providers to help them advance their projects. And shout out to Karen from Blue Door, who we're working on one of her projects in Newmarket now that I'll share in a minute. Hopefully this clicker works. But so for today, you've got Ewan and I. We're going to speak about some of the stuff that we're working on from an initiatives perspective, especially one called Base Design, which we went through the Housing Supply Challenge with CMHC on it. Last year, we're really excited, and we're using it to advance a lot of mid-rise projects across the country. Like I mentioned, so, this is just to give you a sense of where and how we work. So all those dots up there, we've been super privileged to be able to work from coast to coast to coast. We have projects in Cambridge Bay and Iqaluit up north in Nunavut. We've developed with BC Housing on the west coast, and then many in Ontario that we're working on now. And these 4 projects are actually projects that our team is leading that are in construction as of right now, as of this year. And again, our team, we are independent of construction. And I think this really really exemplifies it. So out of these 4 projects, each one is with a different nonprofit. So the one on the left is with the Victoria Park Community Homes, 60 Caledon Avenue in Hamilton. That was the rendering you saw on the title screen there. 261 units, a mix of market and affordable. And on that one, Elliston is the contractor because the project makes sense for Elliston as a design builder to be involved. But as you go, kind of to the right, we've also got projects with Veterans House Canada, Missinaibi Cree First Nation, and Blue Door Housing. And we've kind of approached it really with a best of project mindset. That's kind of the view that we take for all of our projects. Not all projects make sense for Elliston Construction to build, and our team, we are an actual independent entity within the enterprise, and so we have that ability to pick and choose what makes the most sense. So for Veterans House Canada in the middle left and Blue Door at Gate 35 Gorham Street on the far right there, we actually worked with our clients to procure the right third-party contractor under the right kind of construction model so that it worked best for the funding, most importantly, and our clients ultimately. And then, the middle right and the far left we did with Elston because those ones, it made sense. They were plus $100 million projects, and there was a scale and capacity where Elston, as contractor, could be competitive. But I thought I'd just share that because a lot of folks, especially when they first see our name, they're kind of like, hey, you're just a construction guy in a different outfit trying to get more construction work for the beast. And, we actually have the opposite problem internally where most of our projects, I mean, many of you will probably feel the same. No one's building like a 500 unit mega tower in I don't know, Timmins, Ontario, as an example. There's a lot more need for more thoughtful mid-rise development across multiple sites as a way to tackle specific neighborhoods with some context. And that's kind of where we come into the picture, where not all of our projects are fit, and Elston Construction is just too big sometimes and too expensive to make sense on all of our projects. So I thought I'd share that. We kind of manage end to end for our clients. So we'll, on the technical side, get through zoning, land acquisition, all that fun stuff, but we'll also raise all the financing as well, whether it's through AHF, ACLP, MLI Select, or other programs as it comes up, NICHI, ISK, and grants and that sort of stuff. So for today, what we wanted to share was something that we've been kind of cooking for the last few years. One thing we saw in almost all of our projects, especially working with smaller nonprofits, is everyone struggled with the old regime of getting to a Class B budget in order to submit for CMHC financing. That was always a huge barrier. Because to get to that Class B, you generally got to get to 50 to 60% design development. That's $500,000 to $1 million, depending on how big your project is. And not everyone has that type of money to spend for the chance to apply for potential funding. And when we looked at these projects, we noticed a lot of similarities. Most groups were trying to hit, CMHC's accessibility and energy efficiency requirements at the onset. Most projects were in that, call it 3 to 6 story range. And you generally needed a mix of units, but most of the projects that we were seeing, it was less supportive housing and a lot more mid-market housing where you'd have a mix of market and affordable. So you needed that kind of standardization. So we came up with what we call base design, which is basically a licensable kit of parts design, similar to what CMHC has now released on the low-rise side, but this is specifically focused at mid-rises as a way to jumpstart and get you Class B ready from the onset, essentially. So we've developed this together so that it meets the AHF requirements of 2020 NECB accessibility requirements. It's flexible enough so that you have providers who want a family mix, it can do that. If you want all studios and there's more of a seniors focus, it can do that as well. But the big thing is it'll lower a lot of those upfront costs, the upfront risk of actually getting a project to that Class B level, so that you can get into the ground much faster. I think we just have a few slides showing some of the different iterations and what you can do with it, really. I do have a rendering somewhere that shows, these all kind of look similar with the same sort of block design, but we've worked with our construction side to make sure that to vet this across multiple systems so that, from a facade perspective, it can really look different. You can use different materials. And a big thing with this is we designed it so that it is structurally agnostic. So what we learned through the RHI experience from a couple of years back is sometimes you may pick a horse like a building supplier horse from the onset that may or may not work for your project, and you only find that out after you're $1 million in to design, and it's really hard to redo that. With this, when we put this design together, we made sure that it worked with both panelized and volumetric systems across panelized steel. You have your precast concrete providers, and then your typical kind of volumetric modular providers as well. So that as an owner, if you have this design, you can kind of apples to apples compare multiple building providers to pick the one that makes the most sense. And we're seeing this in action now. We're working on kind of a multi-site project across Northern Ontario, and we're seeing, there's different trade availability depending on which city you're in. This allows you to pick the provider that makes the most sense in those regions. If there's a shortage of labor, you can take it. You can make sure that you're not caught by that shortage by picking a solution that is more readily available. So this can be built, stick built, mass timber, panelized steel, precast concrete, so on and so forth. Just a couple examples again of the interiors, exteriors, and everything else. And I'll pass it to Ewan, my colleague here, who will walk through a couple examples of when we're using this live on projects right now, where we're seeing the design and cost savings in the upfront phase.
Thank you, Ashwin. So one of the biggest problems we see in the affordable housing space is how long it takes to get to that shovel-ready space. So traditionally speaking, we usually see it takes around a year or possibly even longer. So when we look at a traditional build, we're looking at around 7 to 8 months in the schematic and design development stage, followed by 8 months in the construction document phase. But with base design, you're already at that 60% kind of template vetted level, so you're already at that Class B estimate. This shaves around 60% or 6 months of time or 45% of the schedule savings. This allows you to kind of get to that building permit level and apply for funding a lot sooner. With this product, it is looked at to get to build quicker, but I believe the biggest asset is to de-risk earlier. So here as well, so this is our cost savings. So traditionally in a normal build, we usually see the costs in the pre-development stage come all up at the upfront. So your consultants, like your engineers, your architects, your energy models, your accessibility reviews. But with the base design, this is all kind of already completed. So you kind of skip all that and you kind of are stuck at a base point one step above. Most of the costs in that beginning phases is the reiterations of going back and forth at the design level. But with the base design, again, you are already there. With that being said, you are already 40% we see savings in costs when it comes to the pre-development side. So what do you get with the base design? So first and foremost, you get the pre-vetted template designs across multiple building systems, like Ashwin said. Next, you get that completed energy model report, which CMHC requires to get their funding. Also, you get a comprehensive user manual and a step-by-step guide on how to use the base design once you purchase it and kind of how you go from there with your consultants. And then most importantly, your completed Revit files, which is all your architectural designs and your ready for use adaptation and kind of customization of the product. Here's just another sample of what you kind of get with the base design. These are all your packages, like your architectural, your mechanical, electrical, structural designs. Again, your energy model, but these are all going to be your Revit files across different building systems within these different disciplines. So how to use the base design. So obviously, first and foremost, you got to license the base design. And then step 2 is to procure a design team and expedite the Class B. Again, you are at that Class B already, so once you get it, you're at that Class B, and then you go procure a team. Third, you got to use the base design to evaluate systems during pre-construction. So like Ashwin said, not every building system is going to fit your need or want in whatever area you may be. And then lastly, you get to customize the base design. If you want to be more 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, whatever the case may be, that's when you go back with your design team and kind of alter the base design. I can hand it back to Ashwin to go through another initiative we have.
Sorry, and one thing I forgot to mention off the top was with base design. So when we had put it out there, I mentioned we're an independent group within Elliston. So with base design, we've released it on kind of an independent basis, so groups can license it from us and there's no obligation to have Elliston build the project or EDCB be the development manager. So we're talking to a number of groups that are looking to license this, and they'll be using it independently, so they can, if you're a municipality or an owner, you license it. You can run your own RFP for consultants that we've pre-vetted through, that have already gone through our system. They know the system well, and they can get you those savings up front. And then you can run an RFQ or a procurement for the actual building system provider itself. So we've really taken the lens when we went through the CMHC Housing Supply Challenge of making sure this works without us. Like our ultimate goal is people use this thing without us to ultimately get more housing developed and out of the gate. I'll also say, Ewan probably joined our team about 2 years ago, so this is probably his first big presentation in front of a crowd like this, so just well done. He prepared long and hard. So I appreciate you guys and the time. We did have another initiative, but I think base design was the core of what we wanted to share. I thought one thing that I thought would be interesting is this right here. So these are projects that we delivered for the City of London under the RHI program, and we delivered all three, over rounds 1, 2, and 3. We used a panelized system, the Can-Am Hambro system, to deliver these projects, and I think we were we're very proud to say we were one of the ones that finished each project under the 12-month timeline that each round had, and we got it done for each system. Elliston actually had its own modular factory at the time, but our team was the one that actually decided to go with a third-party provider because it made more sense for this project specifically. Like, just they could meet the timelines that we required that our own factory couldn't, and we ultimately ended up going with that solution. But this is emblematic of what we're trying to achieve, I think, with base design as well, where if you have one 30-unit project on its own, maybe you can't get the attention of Build Canada Homes or whoever it may be. But if you have multiple sites using the same sort of common thread of a similar design and systems, you can take advantages of those efficiencies of scale and scope so that you can advance a lot more units under the same sort of timeline. Same amount of work, right, whether one project or 5. So I thought I'd share that because that's a pretty good case study. Some of the renderings we showed earlier, the one on our title slide, that's using the Majest precast concrete system. So that's a panelized system as well, which is precast concrete panels and CFS walls. And we're seeing a lot of great results out of that one too in terms of time and cost for our nonprofit client there. So I'll leave it there. That's our base design in a nutshell. We've got plenty of material here if you'd like to check out a catalog or anything like that, and happy to take any questions after the fact too. Oh, sure.
Well, I went very quickly past my own introduction. I'm especially pleased to hear that because I also chair the CMHC board. So Supply Challenge finalist is very well received. A really, really cool project. So questions for Elliston on, yeah, go ahead. Can you use the mic there?
There we go. Testing. There we go. I mean, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you that answer, non-answer, just saying I can't give you a specific cost, unfortunately, but the projects we're seeing in the north, we're taking advantage of a lot of the, a lot of panelized systems, quite honestly, just because it seems to be what makes the most sense from a cost and risk perspective for the most part. It's interesting you brought the scale up with our base design. That's been one thing that's come up. One of the communities we were working with, they don't have fire trucks that can go above 2 stories. So even though they love to build a 3-story, the need is there. The fire code won't allow it, so we have to scale it down on that front. But ultimately, like for Northwest Territories, I imagine like the scale, building system providers, trade availability are all going to play a pretty good factor. So I don't know if it'll actually scale 1-to-1 for savings, unfortunately.
Can you just mention companies about
Sure. We're working with a group, the Kitikmeot Friendship Society. So Cambridge Bay is, if you look at Nunavut, Iqaluit's on the far right. Cambridge Bay is kind of right in the middle. There's a lot of stuff happening there now with the federal government on Grays Bay and other big nation building projects. But we're working with them on a sort of a master planned community. So the hamlet had a few lots open up for multi-use development. And KFS offers supportive housing services and also a lot of child-focused services. So we're going to build a daycare and then a couple housing units. It'll be about 10 to 20, depending on the funding that we get. But we're helping them in the early stage get the project set up for success.
And I think the emphasis on modular that we're hearing from the federal government has obviously application in cities or anywhere where a lot of supply is needed. But the other trend that I'm hearing is forward deployment of factories that are even sort of pop-up capabilities, especially sort of at the end of the highway at Yellowknife, and then barging or flying even panelized kits of parts up into other communities. So when there's a standard design you can work with and a factory opening up that's being surged and even considered defense spending in a lot of cases, because there's going to be two things we spend money on in this country for the next 10 years, which is housing, yay, and defense. But there's some two-for-ones in there where a lot of that housing in the north can be double counted. So hopefully that's a tailwind for communities like yours.
Cambridge Bay is like a sea level.
Yeah, barging or even airshipping dirigibles and things like that. How do we get things in and out of the north? Interesting logistics challenge. Go ahead.
What's the project that you're working on in
We were working with Ukutaq Society, in which those projects are under construction now.
Other questions for, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think this is one piece of the puzzle. Again, this is the one that we would always see, the design piece. But the bigger challenge, which I think we're seeing addressed, is like zoning and site plan and servicing or development permit, depending on where you are. So this works really well, like for the projects that we've been involved in on a portfolio basis. The step one before we even look at this is saying, do you have a zoning in place and servicing that can service a 25-unit building if that's your vision? And then we can rejig the Lego blocks to work. But if that's not there, then there's no point spending money on design if you don't have those upfront items completed. So, and then in terms of, I think, compromise, I think the biggest one, I'm assuming there's not many architects in the audience here. Sometimes I get the whole, hey, that looks like a freaking Soviet building, for better or worse. I do have a better rendering in here of a project that we're actually working on. Let me see if we can find it. I don't think everyone can see it. We should have put it on the slide. That's my mistake. But it looks different than that building. So it really goes to show, like, from a facade exterior system perspective, you can still get that articulation. We're just trying to stay away from, like, we've seen the balconies hurt your energy modeling and thermal bridging. I see a lot of nods. And we wanted to make sure, like, we were picking systems that we know would last as well, that were still cost effective. So yeah, you're not going to have like a glazed glass building that looks super beautiful. Not that that isn't beautiful. I think it's very beautiful, but just I think that is a little bit of the compromise. You're getting a bit of that standardization of the building ultimately, layouts and that sort of stuff.
I'm sorry to ask, but it's really a great question. Since you're actually allowing clients to get the Revit file, how do you get that, keep that Revit file from being shared? How do you,
Did everyone hear the question? Can you repeat?
Yeah, he was just asking, since we're sharing the actual design files, how do we retain our intellectual property, essentially? So it is a licensing agreement. There's a bit of risk we're taking where when we share this design with groups, it may proliferate outside of our control. We're trying to pick our clients carefully, to be quite honest, like just groups that won't ultimately blast this out. Again, if a layperson, like if I just got a Revit file, there's not much I can do with it. You'll still need a team around the design itself. So you'll still need to, if you wanted to take the files, you'd still need to bring on your own architect and everything else. One thing I realized we didn't have in there was through our base design program. So given this is where we take advantage of our big brother, Elliston. Elliston has relationships with all consultants across Canada. So we actually had consultants across the board come into our program, work with us to put this together. And we have like a pre-vetted list of about 10 to 20 consultants that recognize the value. And because if you gave the Revit files to a consultant that has no idea of what this is, they're never going to take it on. They're going to say, well, I just got to redraft it myself, right? It's the same amount of money either way. But these consultants have been part of the development of the package. So that's why their pricing up front is cheaper, because they're familiar with the systems and the flexibility that we've put in.
Take the liberty of one, well, go ahead quick, and then I'll ask a quick question, then we'll switch to the second panel. So
so the structure, the design, the kits, they're optimized to work towards set CMHC objectives, correct?
Yeah, so all in in terms of the actual Revit files that were up there quickly, we have like a concrete version, a wood version, and then a panelized steel version. But all three we energy tested to make sure that it met CMHC's energy requirements. And in the layouts you would have seen, like we have non-accessible units and then accessible units, so that in whatever iteration you put the blocks together, you'll still have an accessible building from the definition of CMHC.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand that first. So have you thought about what specific requirements might be good to change on the CMHC side of things? Or how would you react if those requirements did change? Would that throw your whole system out of work?
So the one black box is, with Build Canada Homes coming out, like we don't know, maybe they take an entirely different view on energy modeling and they want a different system or a different energy requirement. Maybe they want everything to be net zero carbon. So we've built in a bit of like, we want to keep updating this like year over year so that we're always up to date with the latest and greatest from a code and energy perspective. But we're pretty confident, like this meets Tier 2 2020 NECB. I'm pretty sure from what I've heard from Build Canada Homes, like they're not trying to recreate that part of the wheel. They're looking at the scale piece. So they'll probably retain some of the same standards. I'm sure down the line that might change, but there might be. Oh, it sounds like you might know that answer already.
Do you want to go?
I just have a quick question around like Alcon is like a community for employee-owned business. So are there like with the community bill, is there still some profit margins that the community or the employee-owned business
Just so, yeah, so if you mentioned Elson is an employee-owned company, so founded by a family, but now the employees are slowly kind of buying them out. For our project, so EDCB, we're still a for-profit entity, just to be super, super clear. We're still a development manager for many of our nonprofit clients. For the projects that Elliston is building, like you and I and our team is on the other side of the table of our construction colleagues. I actually don't know what profit margin they may have put in their bid there, but we're pushing them down so that their number works with the funding ultimately. And so for those projects, it's worked on a holistic basis, and like we're able to take a lot more risk off the plate of nonprofits too. But I can't speak to like, I don't know, specific profit margin on each one, but we do like our team would charge a fee on projects that we're developing.
Everybody's got to get paid. You got one last question there.
Just a quick question, given you work across the country and combine federal funding with likely provincial and perhaps other sources, do you run into barriers with a province saying, well, we like you, but we want to prioritize like local companies, local developers, local construction companies, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, great question. Especially the last like 5 years, it's always been one of our clients calls it lasagna funding, right? To make a $100 million project work, like you get the CMHC AHF, that's the pillar of your capital stack, but then you get like 5 other things on top. I mean, I'd say Karen from Blue Doors in the audience, so I'll poke at your project. Like that one there, we have a whole bunch of different funders in the mix, and it's definitely a bit of a jigsaw puzzle to make sure it all works, but that's the name of the game. From an Elliston Community Builders or Elliston perspective, so the first thing we offer for many groups is you don't have to work with Elliston if you work with us. So we have the projects that we work third party. But for the projects where Elliston is involved, generally speaking, as a contractor, if you have a 100% project budget, Elliston as GC sometimes will only self-perform maybe 10% of the work as an example. A lot of the other work is done locally. So a good example, like Northern Ontario, that was one concern that was brought up in a couple of these small communities, but it was basically like ED can kind of wrap the project at a portfolio level to give comfort to, a BCH or other funding entity that, hey, if something goes really wrong, we can go after that performance guarantee and bonding from Elliston. But at a local level, Elliston ends up actually doing most of the work through local trades, whoever is available to actually do the project. They're more like the aggregator and providing a PCG that's ultimately valuable to funders.
Well, thanks, fellas. This is a very, very cool initiative, and we appreciate your answering the questions and being here today, supporting the conference. So let's give Ash and Ewan a round of applause. You guys will stick around. You've got some brochures and some QR codes if people want to click in, find some more information. So don't go too far, fellas. Meantime, I'm going to invite Alina McKay to come on up and introduce panel number 2, the balanced supply of housing team that's here. So come on up.
Thanks, Don. Oh, this IT is going to help me. Yeah. Yeah, just the extend screen so we can see the notes, please. Yeah. Perfect. Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks, Don, for the introduction. So, do I have all my panelists? Great. Okay. Oh my gosh. Hello and welcome. My name is Lena McKay, and I'm with the Balanced Supply of Housing, and I'm the research manager. And I have the pleasure of facilitating today's panel, Scaling Up Nonprofit Housing. So I'd like to start this presentation with a land acknowledgement. I'm reflecting on my time in Jojaigai, colonially known as Montreal, which has been cared for since time immemorial by the Gananageha, or Mohawk people, who are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So I actually have memories of this place and friendships from living in Montreal more than 2 decades ago, I guess. And so, and in my current role, I'm lucky to continue to be able to work with nonprofit housing providers, creating opportunities for affordable housing, ensuring work that includes Ganahagi and Haudenosaunee voices. So I'm just hoping that that's reflected in our work moving forward with balanced supply of housing. So thank you to be here on these lands today. So what is the balanced supply of housing? Just in terms of an outline, I'm going to be introducing who we are, our research, introducing our panelists, and then we'll move into the panel discussion where there'll be some key questions for each of them, and then questions from each of you. So anyone opening the floor to questions as well. So the Balanced Supply of Housing is a collaborative network of academic researchers and community partners that conducts rigorous community-based research and data analysis to foster a just and equitable housing system through knowledge generation and mobilization. So this in turn shapes our vision of informing policy and system change to address socioeconomic and racial inequalities so that the right to housing is realized and everyone is housed well. Our research focuses on Canada's urban centres, including Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, where 1 in 3 of Canadians live. And we work with 19 academic researchers and 17 nonprofit organizations and have funded over 40 research projects. Each of our research projects includes both academic researchers and nonprofit partners to ensure that findings are relevant and have real-world applications. Our research projects focus on 4 areas. So reshaping the financialization of housing, innovating in responsive land use practices, and designing sustainable housing futures. We also help share knowledge findings and updates, and we draw on a range of different knowledge mobilization tools, including reports, journal articles, webinars, podcasts, and blogs. And we organize collective events or collaborative events, including bringing our researchers and nonprofit partners together to strengthen our research capacity and network. So our research on designing sustainable housing futures has included, it's not how dense we make it, it's how we make it dense with Nick Luca, that looks at just the different ways that cities can be built and how that impacts, how livable a city is and how communities are formed. We also have Housing Beyond the Market with AJ Bim, which was a master's thesis and looked at nonprofits specifically in Quebec and barriers to building. A report that Nick Luca and Conrad worked on around single-stair residential buildings, and that was specifically for the province of British Columbia, where single-stair egress buildings are being considered, and also that, just noting that there is changes to the National Building Code that Conrad and Nick also worked on that are pursuing around that. So if you're interested in that, we won't be talking about that today, but that is an area where we have done research. We also have a report series on community land trusts, which are a really interesting nonprofit model we'll be talking a little bit more about today. And so, as well as a recent report on tools to overcoming institutional barriers to nonprofit housing. That is with Adam Mongrain, Inez, Gabriel Cote, AJ Bim, and Leila Ghaffari were all part of that. And that actually talks specifically around barriers that nonprofit providers in Montreal experienced when they were working in Montreal. So I would say, though, that many of the barriers that were found in the report are across the country and work that Balanced Supply of Housing has done in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver as well. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. So Dr. Nick Luca is an associate professor with a joint appointment at McGill's Peter Guha Fu School of Architecture and School of Urban Planning. He's also the Associate Director of the Center of Interdisciplinary Studies of Research in Montreal, and he specializes in housing, landscape studies, ethnography, and critical studies of design and planning. He is the academic lead on a number of BSH projects, including projects with Vivre en Ville and Village Urbain. So next we have Nat Pace. Nat is the Network Director of the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. In this role, they have grown the network to include over 40 land trusts across Canada and deepened connections and collaboration within the community land trust sector, both within Canada and abroad. We also have Erica Sagart with us. Erica is the Director of Sector Capacity at the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, where she has worked with nonprofit housing providers at all levels of government to facilitate collaborative evidence-based decision-making. And then finally, we have Inez Zeluki, is a town planner and housing policy advisor at Vivre en Ville. In this role, she brings a deep passion for decolonizing methodologies and creating inclusive urban planning systems and policies that contribute to more vibrant and livable cities. So I'm happy to have you all here with me today. So Inez, I wanted to start with you. So you recently worked on the report Tools for Overcoming Institutional Barriers to Nonprofit Housing Production. One of the key recommendations in the report was the need for reliable pre-development funding to help projects become shovel-ready. How important is this first stage of the project to nonprofit developers?
Yeah, so the pre-dev stage
Oh.
is or now it works.
Yeah.
Okay. So the pre-development stage is really like the foundation of any real estate project, no pun intended. And very quickly, for those of you who haven't necessarily worked in real estate and are not necessarily like familiar with the process, I'll talk more about first how it works in the private sector before moving on to the nonprofit housing providers like reality. So obviously first you need a plot of land and you need to complete site evaluations with a surveyor. You might need a decontamination expert and maybe even an archaeologist. Second, you might need to assess the community needs to understand exactly what kind of building and what kind of units to build. So, for example, maybe you're near a university and so you need studios. Then you need to make financial projections. So that's called a pro forma, and that's basically based on pricing, construction and development costs, the mortgage, the price of per square foot, and maybe even the rental income for potentially like commercial tenants. And you also need to assemble a team of professionals with mainly architects and engineers to draft site and building plans. And you then need to navigate all of the city regulations to make those building plans, but then the plans are needed to actually get the permit. So that's a lot of work, obviously, and that requires a lot of high upfront costs without necessarily any guarantees of the project coming along. And so there's a lot of uncertainty based on the permitting processes, maybe changing political cycles, and changing market conditions. So having myself worked in real estate development, I've seen a few projects get canceled, put into hiatus, being reconsidered, or just stuck in limbo because of permitting issues. And so in the private sector, a real estate developer will fund all of these activity with internal capital, pre-existing funds, bridge loans, revolving credits, and investor money. But while private real estate developers will have access to equity, that's not necessarily the case for nonprofit housing providers. So they won't have deep capital reserves, and they don't necessarily have other projects that have enough profit to generate like financing for months or years of pre-development work. And so that puts them in a very tough situation, especially since most nonprofit housing providers don't even receive mission-based funding and have, as such, might have difficulties keeping staff and funding their daily activities. That's a structural disadvantage for nonprofit housing projects. And in our research, we found that this pre-dev gap is one of the most serious institutional barriers to nonprofit housing across Canada and Quebec. And specifically in Quebec, but we've seen historically that nonprofit housing has been funded through the Accès Logis program for those early costs. But once the program Accès Logis was axed for the Programme d'Habitation Abordable du Québec, so the FAC, the funding was only available for projects that had already done the pre-development stage. And so that means now that nonprofit housing developers are expected to shoulder all of the risks while the government doesn't necessarily take on any of it. And so this changes the entire dynamic of how projects evolved, and without all of that funding, nonprofit developers can't secure land when opportunities arise, they can't act quickly in competitive markets, and they can't necessarily commission proper studies and early design work. And so that drives up delays, and a project that might be possible a year becomes impossible the next. So to resume very quickly, pre-development stage is really like a make it or break it period for any project, but even more so for nonprofit housing providers. Thanks.
Thanks, Inez. So Nat, the next question is for you. You work with community land trusts across Canada. Can you provide a brief overview of how community land trusts are different from other forms of nonprofit housing?
Yes, okay, salut, ça va? Can people, from 1 being I know nothing to 5, I know quite a bit about community land trusts, raise your hand and let me know where you are from 1 to 5. It helps me kind of, okay, it's actually all over, so not that helpful. Okay, so great question, and one I get a lot. How are community land trusts different from other forms of affordable housing? And the first thing I would say is, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to call community land trusts a form of affordable housing, because more what they are is a model of land stewardship, which lends well to nonprofit housing. But it extends, because it is really a model of stewarding real estate. A community land trust can be used for housing and much more. We have community land trusts in Canada, for example, focused on arts and cultural assets as well. So I'll start there. It's a model that's rooted in principles of community ownership, permanent stewardship, forever affordability, as well as community governance. So I think that those are some of the strengths the model brings. I could talk about each of those ad nauseum. Something that's unique about community land trusts that I think sometimes gets lost in the sauce is it is a Black invention. Community land trusts were created in the Deep South in 1969 was the first community land trust, created at the time in rural Georgia by Black tenant farmers and organizers who were facing just wide-scale displacement off of their land by white landowners who were owning the farmlands that they were working on. So these folks, created a new model of a nonprofit that held land and would lease land out to people, to Black farmers. And the idea that the land then would be secured and held in perpetuity by the nonprofit. So community land trusts kind of come from this very sort of liberatory historical context. And so I think, a lot of what community land trusts do, besides the stewardship of the land, they're much more than real estate portfolios, is that they directly interrogate and they challenge the politics of land ownership. Who owns land, how they're using that land, who's empowered by our current real estate system, who's disempowered. Unfortunately, that can sometimes also get lost in the sauce when community land trusts are kind of thought of as a tool for affordable housing or whatnot. There is this much more broader sort of, like I call it like a liberatory potential that they come from. And so today, in Canada, I think it makes sense that a lot of the community land trusts are led by equity-deserving communities. If you go over in Nova Scotia there, most of the land trusts out there are led and serving African Nova Scotian communities. So I really love it that there's this lineage, from the first community land trust to present day in Canada. It is often Black communities that are leading the movement here. Or you have groups such as like the Chinatown Community Land Trust in Toronto. Here, I know the GIA Foundation in Chinatown is kind of getting involved. Communities that have, faced rampant displacement. This building we're in right now was a project of, that cleared what was formerly Montreal's Chinatown, reduced it to a very small part of the city to build this. You see these organizations, often community land trusts, popping up in areas of where communities are readily facing displacement, and it's a strategy. It's an anti-displacement strategy. Last point here is I also just wanted to say that this isn't to say community land trusts are not. I'm not trying to suggest that they're the replacement for nonprofit housing providers at all. Not at all. I think that they're much more a friend than a competitor. So if I can give you an example, in Toronto you have the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, and they acquired a hefty portfolio of housing. The Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust specializes in sort of the management and stewardship of that physical asset of the building, but they've partnered with the YWCA Toronto, who actually provides the operation of that building. It's women-led households living there. So there's this sort of like CLT as owner, nonprofit service provider as operator sort of model we see in CLTs as well. So. Yeah, question I get a lot, how are they a unique affordable housing model? But I think, you can zoom out quite a lot and see that they're much more. They can do that, but they're also, can be much more than that,
Thanks, Nat. And many communities are using community land trusts to acquire buildings that are at risk or of displacement, and where people could be losing affordable housing to keep that housing affordable. What role do you feel that acquisition programs play in protecting affordable housing and scaling up nonprofit responses to affordable housing as well?
Well, I think it's huge, at this state of the emergency, housing emergency. I think, we need to really do what's quick, but also makes sense. So acquisition, can certainly speed up scaling the stock of community housing in Canada. Community land trusts have been successful using existing acquisition funding programs to purchase real estate. I think in my role, I can see directly where there are existing housing acquisition funds available. You see community land trusts be able to grow much quicker. And, I think a story that's not always told is the role that community land trust, particularly in Toronto, the Parkdale Community Land Trust had in the advocacy, demanding that the city sort of creates a municipal acquisition fund, which they did in response to tireless organizing by Parkdale. So just to say, CLTs are certainly, the majority of them in Canada, I would say, are looking more at acquisition-based strategies than new construction strategies, because there's often about, protecting what's there, protecting what's at risk of being lost. But we're going to need the government to hand over the checkbook to really get that one going, to put it bluntly.
Thanks, Nat.
Yeah.
So Nick, moving to you. And then with this question, I want to address sort of sometimes what can be the elephant in the room is YIMBY responses to nonprofit housing that can really slow, projects and create a lot of roadblocks. So I've heard you make the argument that households don't know what they want because they've never seen it. Following this, you've pointed to some of Canada's most vibrant and livable neighborhoods that have a mix of housing types, including townhouses, multiplexes and apartment buildings, and a range of tenures, including a mix of renters and owners. In many cases, this mix also benefits nonprofit housing providers by opening up opportunities for smaller developments and greater acceptance of renter households. So what can municipalities do to help create opportunities and acceptance of a richer mix of housing and tenures?
That's a pretty big question, and I will be brief in answering because I think there's so many ways in which we could tackle it. I think I'm going to sidestep the question by saying what can municipalities do is a matter of what can other levels of government do so that municipalities can do more to enable nonprofit housing. And I think the first thing that we need to think about, I'm going to echo a point that was made, I think, by Ash, which is, or was in your slide deck, housing is infrastructure. Housing is basic infrastructure. It's basic provision and it's a basic right. And municipalities shouldn't be treating it as though it's a commodity. And the problem that we have in the way that Canada is organized constitutionally is that local municipalities are addicted to property taxes. They account for about 90% of the operating budget for a typical municipality. The upshot of that is that local municipalities are basically in the business of gentrification. They want to see value uptick. They want to see intensification of land use. They want to see increases in exchange value on real property. And they're stuck in that position because higher levels of government don't let them raise funds in any other way. They sometimes throw a few scraps from the table and say, okay, doggy, doggy, try to eat it, see if that'll keep you going. So I think one of the basic things is that municipalities need to be empowered in new ways to be able to do the sorts of things that are needed in the current housing crisis. That's an exciting sort of prospect, and we've had some promising first steps made in Quebec. There were a whole bunch of powers that were actually devolved from the provincial level to the municipal level, in fact, to enable the bylaw for a mixed metropolis. Really have to think about what it is in, it's a règlement pour le métropole mixte, what the name is in English. It's not been successful because all the building that has taken place has provided cash in lieu of affordable units. But it actually was an example of where the provincial government said municipalities can have a bit more power and a bit more latitude to do things that are in their jurisdiction in real and legal terms. I think a second thing is I'm gonna come back to the point and said we're not going to talk about, but it's the single egress. I'm going to go back to the single egress, and it's a tricky thing to explain, but we have a funny thing in our national building code, and Canada and the United States are the only two countries in the world that have this, which is that multifamily housing needs to have a second internal staircase, or else everyone's going to die in a fire, because we're afraid of fires that may have happened a long time ago when we had a lot of matchstick houses and a lot of illegal second, third, 15th units being built. So I am working with a big coalition, a huge coalition in fact, to get the National Building Code reform to allow for single egress, just one staircase, on up to a certain number of stories. And that can really be calibrated to some of the points that were made earlier around how high we can go. Many fire departments don't have ladders that go above 2 stories, so thank you for bringing that point forward. That's one example. It's very rare. If you think about, the work that we're all trying to do in terms of reform and action on housing, it's very rare that we can say, you know what, there's a breaker panel or there's a mixing board where the DJ works. The National Building Code reform on single egress is one of those rare cases where we can say, wow, there's one dial and we just need to adjust something on it, and suddenly we'll start to see lots more units being produced. And of course, this is the kind of thing that when we started working on it around just before COVID really hit, at least on Turtle Island, we were told quite plainly, it's going to take 10 years to do that, if it ever happens. So it's the usual sort of, oh, that could never happen. It's like every conversation is the conversation with my father. There's going to be a lineup if we go to that restaurant. So that's one of the challenges, right? The sort of knee-jerk reaction that it's not possible. Didn't matter. We're going to go on Christmas Eve. There's going to be a lineup. There's not going to be a lineup, Dad. Anyway, so I use that as an example because municipalities can jump onto that bandwagon, can join the chorus, can sign the documents that are saying we want this kind of reform, and do more knowledge sharing to find other kinds of things that deserve to be changed. And so then the third thing I'm going to say is going to echo some of Nat's points, which is that, for instance, acquisition, for instance, land banking, for instance, facilitating and most importantly, I would say, making some of the upstream processes that Ines was talking about easier, quicker, shovel-ready, so that you don't have to get to 60% design and invest the $500,000 and so on and so forth, right? So I'll teach you all a fantastic word that my mother taught me in French, débroussaillage. Débroussaillage. Clearing away the thickets is the closest equivalent to it in English. We need to sort of clear away the cobwebs and the layers and the contradictory sets of rules, regulations, and processes that make the upstream part of doing building and land procurement so difficult and so challenging. And that could include the scaling down idea that came out in one of the questions, right? That we need to figure out ways so that nonprofit builders can actually build stuff without having to go through all the headaches and hassles of land assembly, of rezoning, of decontamination. And that's potentially where municipalities can play a role. But again, that it becomes part of this sort of vicious cycle that municipalities need to be able to procure land. And so maybe we should think a little bit differently about land that is in public ownership, as in street rights of way and so on and so forth, so that we could identify easy land bank sources and also start to develop a more concerted and multi-level strategy for land procurement for nonprofit housing as a permanent, affordable, basic infrastructure investment. And that could include emphyteutic leases, so long-term leases, 99-year leases, $1 a year. That could include community land trust enabling and a whole bunch of other things. But I think we have to think about ways in which local municipalities can build their own capacity, but also build capacity within the ecosystem of housing production. And that sometimes just starts with sort of looking through the cobwebs and the many different hurdles that have been created in terms of approvals and regulatory compliance. Fast tracking on affordable nonprofit housing, differential zoning. These are all examples that are being explored all across Canada and around the world. So those are three key areas in which I think municipalities could potentially make a big difference. But there's also an empowerment question that I think is at the core of all of it.
Thanks, Nick. So, Erica, I want to talk to you about the issue that I often see where it can sometimes feel like with each nonprofit, they have to reinvent the wheel when they're going to build a project or bring a project to the table. So you work with nonprofits and providers throughout British Columbia and increasingly across Canada. What have been the most effective ways to get nonprofit providers working together on key issues?
Sure, thanks for the question. First of all, I just want to say, Nat, I'm so glad we're not here to fight about land trust versus nonprofit housing. I had a moment there where I was like, wow, that was a stacked question. No, we do often. There's a lot of collaboration that happens in the community housing sector. And obviously nonprofits and land trusts are in the same room often, and there's a lot of collaboration there, which is really exciting. In terms of providers working together, BC Nonprofit Housing Association serves about 1,200 nonprofit housing providers in BC. So bringing folks together in the sector is what we were created to do about 30 years ago. With our founder getting in a Winnebago and driving across the province and door knocking and saying, hey, we're actually a sector, what if we did this together? So I think a few things come to mind. The first is really offering a shared purpose. So at BC Nonprofit Housing Association, we've focused a lot on ensuring that there's sort of, one direction that we're all moving towards. So we put together an affordable housing plan for BC first in a 2017 provincial election and then updated it for the provincial election last year. And I find that having nonprofits being able to point to one thing, saying this is what we need as a collective sector, has been really valuable, and it has led to a lot of the successes that we see in the province of BC. Our systems really encourage disconnection and competition, and the more that as a sector we kind of allow that to drive the work that we're doing, really the less successful we are. So the more that we really work to counter that, the better that we see things move forward. Creating spaces to congregate, conferences like this are really valuable. I think they become, it feels like a typical part of our work. But as an association that puts on a very large housing conference every November and 4 regional events, I don't think we can underestimate how important it is to bring nonprofits together in spaces. There's a lot of emphasis that I see, not to call out CMHC, I'm sorry, but a conference a couple years ago that was focused on innovation, and there was robot dogs walking around in the lobby early. And I remember thinking to myself, what are we innovating for? Like, what are we here to achieve, right? There's a lot of really wonderful things that are happening in the nonprofit housing sector. And we really do know what we're doing and we know what we need. And when we come together, it's a really good opportunity to share. Like, these are, ways that we've adapted around and worked really successfully to deliver this project. And this is how, really that provider to provider experiences are shared, and we see a lot of leadership that happens just really naturally in these spaces where we come together. And so the third piece is really just providing that opportunity to share good approaches, knowing that we know already how to do this work very effectively. And, while to use BC as an example, there might be a municipality in Metro Van that can't really do what the city of Vancouver does. They might have a lot more in common with a provider on the island or someone up north who's of similar size. So the more that we bring folks together, I see a lot of that natural sharing of experience and approach that really does help us do our work a lot better.
Thanks, Erica. And how do you think that helps nonprofits as well respond to changing funding and government priorities?
Yeah, I think adaptability is just the bread and butter of the nonprofit housing sector. I've been doing this work for 10 years with BC Nonprofit, and the amount of shifts that we've seen in BC in that period of time is kind of unbelievable. And our nonprofit providers have ridden very different waves in that period of time when it comes to government. And so I think the things that we talk a lot about in terms of adaptation in the sector, really diversifying revenue streams, so not letting government off the hook for their obligation to serve the people that live in community, but also recognizing that if you can lean on something like social enterprises or fee-for-service models, looking at work opportunities for tenants that live in buildings, it just strengthens the organizations that we have. And some of the most interesting projects that I've seen in BC are from organizations that really only half of their portfolio relies on government funding. They're able to do a lot of interesting things outside of that space. So seeing more of that. Staying really proactive when it comes to government. Again, we've had a very favorable period of provincial funding when it comes to BC and housing. Things may change, they will change for sure, and being able to adapt and kind of jump on opportunities as they come up is really important. Having that one pager ready, or just a really clear sense of where you're trying to go as an organization, and knowing that when you're in a room with the right person, you can really jump on it, makes a huge difference. And doing that in collaboration with others. So ensuring that, the sector is moving together as one, and being able to, again, adapt over time when government changes means that we're all speaking from one voice. I think where we've seen the most success, it's when the easiest way to ignore the nonprofit housing sector is when we don't agree on what we want. It's very easy for government to say, well, you don't actually know what the solution is here. So wherever we can work through that nuance, get to the broader piece of what do we actually all agree on, we're clearly asking for one thing. It really gives government something very solid to stand behind and say we're doing this in partnership with a sector that really knows what they're doing. So whenever we've been able to do that, that's been really successful. And that kind of collaboration piece in general, I think, is now coming up more than ever, coming up again with Build Canada Homes. Just we're talking about portfolios and we're talking about scale. And I think for folks, the question that I get a lot around Build Canada Homes, there's obviously still a lot of questions with that new approach, but it's for smaller communities who have really small projects and their need is great and it's important. It's as critical as our big communities. And they don't know what that means when they're seeing something that says 300 plus units. They don't know how they're reflected in that. So that kind of collaboration across organizations and taking that lens of we're doing this work together is now being asked of us by the federal government, but it's also a really good opportunity to already do what we do very well and do it at an even bigger scale.
Okay, thanks, Erica. So my last question for all of our panelists is just around the wicked problem of homelessness. We've seen that for every 11 units between 2016 and 2021, an estimated 11 lower rent homes were lost for every one that was added. Given that there's this loss of affordable housing that we're seeing across the country and growing numbers of people experiencing homelessness as well, what types of funding and programs are needed to help nonprofit providers fill the gap? Nat, do you want to start with that one?
All right. I think I would just kind of echo what I was discussing before when it comes to acquisition funding. In the report you raised earlier by Dr. Kuni Kamazaki, he points to it in at least what community land trusts need to fill the gap, which is similar to to non-housing nonprofit housing providers, which is single source intergovernmental acquisition funding. I think, BC has its acquisition fund, Nova Scotia has its acquisition fund, Toronto has its acquisition fund, and now we're going to get the one from the federal government. But obviously it's most powerful if all three levels of government can work together and, complement each other's funding and make it most powerful at the ground. Also, I feel like a broken record because we hear it all the time, but to fund the entire process from the due diligence all the way to rehabbing that's necessary, I think, so many hours and days and lives and careers are wasted just chasing the funding to get the whole project funded. I mean, if it could just be done in one shot, wouldn't that be nice? So prayers up, prayers up.
Inez?
Yeah, so types of funding to successfully fill the gap, I just want to say all of it, but I feel like that would be cheap for everyone that's been sitting here and paid a good money to be here. Well, actually, I want to talk more about the erosion of our housing stock first. You said 11 lower homes were lost for everyone that's been added, but these homes, they don't disappear out of thin air. There's no sinkhole where they used to sit. And so clearly something is happening. And let's just take a very simple example. Let's say we have a 3-unit apartment building in a neighborhood that's being owned by the same couple for the last 50 years. The mortgage has long been paid off, and so the units are rented out for really cheap, under the market rate, and the tenants are able to live there for maybe 22% of their annual income. And so that's pretty neat. But the building then goes up for sale, and once the sale goes through, the new owner, who probably bought it for market price, maybe even more than that, and that is all based on the building's potential revenue. They clearly have a new mortgage to pay, and to make the investment sustainable, rents are now increased significantly. The original tenants are either forced to move out or find new money to cover all of those new costs. And while this might be illegal depending on where you are in the country, in Quebec this is illegal, the law is usually not enforced, and it's pretty hard to find people who are doing this and giving them consequences. And so anyway, the neighbor of the next building sees what's going on. He sees that oh, okay, so the rents have doubled. I could probably do the same, so why not do the same? So this is basically basic price signaling, and it doesn't just happen with rentals. It happens with every type of building, with home prices and land value as well. So when someone sells their home for $200,000 more than what they bought it from, everyone else on the street takes notes, and it's the same pattern everywhere, and that's what we call speculation. So the dynamic has a huge consequence for nonprofit housing providers and community housing providers. And so cities and nonprofits usually can't easily afford to acquire land in a city to build projects that actually help the community. And when they do manage to acquire land, well, the money well usually dries up by the time they want to build. And it leaves nothing for pre-dev work and nothing to actually build the building. So yes, to help nonprofit housing providers build homes, we absolutely need more pre-development funding, like I've talked before, but also how Nate mentioned. But that alone won't be enough. Through the research that we've done with the BSH collaborative, we see that there's barriers that are financial, institutional, and political, structural barriers. But these barriers mean we need to not just address these obstacles, but also the structure itself. And yesterday I was at the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Collaborative Conference, which was really interesting. And I heard an amazing sentence that kind of sums up how I feel about homelessness prevention from the perspective of someone that works in urban planning. And for the housing first approach to be successful, we need housing first. And so we need sufficient funding for nonprofit housing providers because it also means better projects and better buildings that are suited for the communities. We need better laws to protect renters across the country. We need a public and universal rental registry. We need predictable and permanent funding for nonprofit housing providers. We need cities to be able to help access land transfers for nonprofit housing. And we need help in urban planning regulations. So, for example, Quebec has recently allowed differentiated zoning, which basically means that nonprofit housing providers might be able to build bigger, denser, more housing in the same plot of land as compared to a private real estate developer. And I feel like those are the kind of things that we can do. That's not just only throwing money into projects. It's like looking at how we can actually make it happen.
Thanks. Erica?
I don't even remember the question.
Yeah.
No, I do. It's okay. I think I'll just be short and sweet. It's the boring thing to say, but the thing that we need is streamlined and stable funding. Like, it is a topic that we talk around a lot. I'm consistently in meetings with government folks who are asking for cost-neutral solutions, and the reality is we need a supportive housing model that works, and that means it has levels of funding that make it work too, which is capital and operating dollars. It is not cheap to get out of homelessness at all, but we have abandoned folks for years and years and years, and that means that we are seeing a real deep complexity of needs, and that means we need the kind of housing and supports that come with it that actually allow people to stabilize, and ignoring the problem doesn't actually make it any cheaper. Which is an awful way to look at ending homelessness. But anyhow, so that kind of streamlined piece between government and stabilized funding. And then the other thing I would say, I think a piece that we really need to talk about is bringing health to the table in a big way. I feel often that there are snippets of it in these conversations at conferences. We're all so aware of it, the folks who do this work. But regularly, I'm becoming more and more aware of how little health is at the table in a lot of the conversations that we're having around housing solutions. And I think when that comes to homelessness, our providers, nonprofit housing providers, are doing the work of healthcare providers, which is a real struggle. And so we need to bring health to a table in a big way.
Thanks, Erica.
Yeah, I'll be short too. I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is I think that we can streamline, the analogy is at McGill we're in a budget cut situation because of our delightful provincial government thinking that we don't need funding. And so the university came to my School of Architecture and said, how are you going to cut your budget and save us some money? I said, we have 4 tenure-track professor positions that are open, that are empty, that you're refusing to allow us to fill. So we're saving you hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Municipalities can do the same in terms of funding by saying, let's eliminate the costs that have to be borne by the nonprofit housing providers, what Ines was saying about the upstream due diligence, and other sorts of costs. So that's one really important way. I think then to sort of echo, I think one of the really important points I'm hearing here, other levels of government really need to recognize that homelessness is a collective responsibility. It's not something that is limited in any way, even if it's most symptomatic, to local urban municipalities. And I think that one of the ways in which the stable sort of support and funding streams that can be made available is the sorts of programs that we see, such as GRTs, technical resource groups in Quebec, which provide expertise. The CLT network is a network of expertise that helps nonprofit providers do some of that upstream due diligence and just knowledge sharing and access work. And that's something that should be funded by central government. It should not be done in dribs and drabs by local municipalities through little again, table scraps. So.
Thanks, Nick. Nat, you just had something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something because I gave a really weak answer to the response. Sorry, end of day, I'm getting tired. Just the last thing, when it comes to funding, it's just funding as it is, and a lot of the asks, when they're race neutral, we're never going to get to the bottom of it. I think we're living in a settler colony here, and if we want to make any meaningful change, I'm here talking about land stewardship. I think we need to talk about land back as well. So more than just funding, deep structural shift in how we're doing things. So just wanted to add that in because I gave a really weak answer. So let's hear it
And
for some
acquisition
feedback.
plans are very important, right, to protecting affordable housing. So
Yes.
definitely see that as part of it. Yeah. Okay, thanks to our panelists. Is there any questions from the audience or? Oh yeah, and there's a mic there if anyone wants to use it. I had a question for Dawn. So Dawn is mayor. When you were mayor of Edmonton, you introduced the infill roadmap for the city of Edmonton. Can you tell us a bit about the roadmap and how it helped scale up nonprofit housing development?
Sure, we're really burying my biography here. So yes, I am a recovering elected official, but I'll try to be uncharacteristically brief. So the infill roadmap was one of the implementation activities in the city's official community plan, which called for shifting the growth from predominantly suburban to, over time, a much higher proportion of growth happening within the existing footprint of the city to take advantage of the existing infrastructure and services, improve the fiscal efficiency, the sustainability, and the public health outcomes of the community. But to do that, we had to make a lot of land use changes. And there are a lot of the kinds of things that Minister Fraser, through the Housing Accelerator Fund, asked municipalities to do in a matter of months. And it hasn't gone very well in a lot of communities where you try to go from single-family homes to fourplexes in one move. So the infill roadmap was, how do you get to multiplexes in several steps? So essentially, it was an exercise in kind of boiling the frog in the pot very slowly with secondary suites and then single lot subdivision. I just wrote a Substack about reminiscing about some of this, so you can dive into a bit of the story. But it also included, in addition to the basic sort of urban form changes, allowing more density to and more homes to be built on the same piece of land. There was some connective tissue work too around permitting and streamlining electronic permits so that the cycle times were faster for not-for-profit builders, eliminating some of the fees. And in Edmonton's case, we don't use development charges nearly as much as other parts of the country. There's a variety of regulatory and regional dynamics for why that's the case. As a result, we have much higher property taxes because the infrastructure still had to get paid for, but the not-for-profit housing is property tax exempt. So the performers work a lot better that way. And then I think actually the most important thing that we did, and initially it wasn't controversial, but now that we've got 8 plexes where there used to be one house, that is to say a 4-plex on top with 4 accessory dwelling units in the basement. These are not popular. There's one going in next to my dad's house, and I hear about it a lot. Was that only works through eliminating the parking requirements and the parking ratios. So what we called open parking, which has been phenomenal for Main Street. So businesses that used to require parking for the restaurant now can just put in a business and not have to worry about the parking, rely on transit, rely on walking. And so it's improving the vibrancy of the business districts and the mixed use areas. But now, instead of allocating a ton of the land for parking, now you can actually use the site for people to live on instead of cars to live on. And the aha moment for this from an affordable housing perspective was there's a really phenomenal managed alcohol harm reduction transitional and supportive housing project run by Niganan Housing Ventures in Edmonton. It's an Indigenous-led 4-story building. And actually, it's kind of neat. They have what they call the wet floor, the damp floor, and the dry floor as people move through different stages of recovery. But there's also a complete understory of parking in the basement that none of the people who live upstairs have a car. But because historically the city required 1.25 stalls per, there was $1 million worth of absolutely useless parking underneath this affordable housing project. And someone came in and showed us a slideshow with a picture of that and said, this is madness, and it's now a barrier not just to these not-for-profit housing initiatives, but increasingly for densification in areas where there's already transit and so on and so forth. So the most important thing we did was actually the parking changes, but it was a whole roadmap and a coherent plan but we did it over like 8 years, which still pissed people off. When you try to do it in 8 months, you wind up with the backlash issues that that cities are dealing with. So anyway, thanks for the question, and thanks for the panel. Awesome panel. I'm sure there's really neat stuff happening with land trust, particularly in BC with the co-op movement there and what they're doing. And so layering in land from a, how did you put it? A liberatory. I love that. I'd never heard that before, and I didn't know that history from where they come from. So I've learned a lot on this panel. I hope you have too. We have a couple more minutes if there are any questions, if something's occurred. Go ahead.
Yeah, city council, you know that. There's a cultural problem in planning and academia when it comes to housing. They act like regulators, not facilitators. So any feedback you would have, like single egress thing, I love it. It's the faster way of doing it. We talk to our planners and the fire chief, and they want to put you on a pitchfork, right? So what's the actual priority here? If it's housing, like how do we get them to shift without just taking all the money and pushing it away? How do you get them to shift from this regulatory, like planning is policy, it's not engineers, right?
Yeah.
We decide all the things in planning as a city. Right?
Yeah.
So how do we get that shift to occur in an encouraging, fully hopeful way as opposed to a stick in the budget?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I resisted the urge to say, are there any firefighters in the room? Because I knew if there were.
I'm not against like life safety and planning.
Of course not, but the single egress, they literally will skewer us. So I would say, the two things I would say quickly are, I agree completely, and it's one of the reasons I was so pissed off. That's one of the reasons I came into planning from architecture as well, at what was going on in planning, and I think in planning education as well. One is that basically planning in the Anglo-American world is predicated on problem solving, right? The language is all, so we've got pathologies, we've got problems. We're still dealing with Victorian cities. Rather than saying, we've got opportunities, we've got possibilities, how can we enable, how can we facilitate, how can we convene, how can we help to strengthen coalitions, how can we build coalitions? So that's one little part of it. I think that there's reform happening within planning education in that respect, but in the same measure, I mean, Nat maybe can attest to this. I've been in studio presentations where students have said, we're going to have all kinds of rules and regulations, and they're going to have to go through a very thorough and time-consuming review process. And I say that's the last thing that you should be proposing as the member of a public institution. I think the other dimension of it is that we actually have to do some more follow-through, because what has been found in a lot of studies in different places where things like, you know, what Edmonton did so well with the infill roadmap, it's actually people who are at the permit desk who don't understand actually what's going on in terms of the high-level policy priorities. And they don't understand, and it becomes the big book of no, or my dad comes back to life and says, there's going to be a lineup. You can't possibly not have parking, and so on and so forth. So there's not enough of a percolating down through internal education, and so we end up with these cultural institutional pathways, path dependencies within governments, within the regulatory agencies. So it's a sort of a both and, that there's obviously a bunch of the at the source in the university sector and in the professional orders, but it's also that, you know, local governments have to do things to say, actually, we're going to change the way, and we're going to change the norms. We're going to get into a sort of a more emancipatory and possibility-embracing way of approaching, rather than planning being the big book of no, right? The computer says no sort of stereotype that they have.
Go ahead.
Like, absolutely, the people who make the decisions of urban planning are also not necessarily urban planners themselves. And so that creates a huge clash in permitting desks where, like, there might be an urban planner, but at least in my experience, the university kind of teaches us to just apply the laws that are being, like, upheld by the political scene. But also, we have to recognize that urban planning has a huge history of racism and segregation, which is not necessarily talked about a lot. And when I talk with my peers, I often hear them being kind of surprised when I'm like, oh, well, you know, redlining, and how not just in the US, but Canada also has its own history of redlining and of segregating communities to protect land values. And that has a huge toll and impact onto how we view and how we kind of interact with urban planning as a tool now, where it's kind of more so a wall than like a door where we're discussing how to make projects happen and how to serve communities. And it also gets to the conversation of who is part of the community and who are we really serving. And usually when we talk about homelessness, it's like the other groups, it's the other people that we're not necessarily talking about, and we're not talking about the kinds of people experiencing homelessness. And I feel like that gets into the conversation and the question you asked.
I just have one small thing to add. This is a very recent personal victory for me. So I'm an urban planner by trade, and I have a group of grad students at the School of Community and Regional Planning at UBC literally using their final project to map out and explain how planning is getting in the way of affordable housing. Yep. And I'm very, very excited about it. And part of that project is putting together a bunch of advocacy resources so that we can deploy it, because that's actually all I care about. So stay tuned for that, because it should be great. And the students are very, very engaged in the topic. So
We've got time for one or two more quick questions. You want to fast follow?
I'm very excited to hear about thinking about costs and inability, I find, in the planning to realize they're regulating a financial entity.
Yeah.
I had two recent master's students up in the tour of the city, and they had electives in finance. You're regulating a financial industry, so yeah, anything you can do in acting out of the planning world, I would suggest to kind of inject some financiality into that process, or anything that's being worked on currently, because real estate is a financing entity for nonprofits. It's all financing grants and everything else. So you have a regulatory world that doesn't realize that things cost money.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'll just say that certainly in our planning school at McGill, what we do is the studio that I teach is centered on how do you make something go from a set of objectives and hopes and aspirations to a built project, and what are the ways literally that we can dismantle some of these oppressive infrastructures that exist in regulatory frameworks. BC and Ontario have done the as of right, 4 or 6 units on a parcel, but they might as well have just said, we'd like to see more housing, and started to play the kazoo, because there are so many other layers of regulatory controls, parking, who knows what, that actually prevent that from happening. So I agree, short answer is, yeah, we do have them go through municipal finance and real estate financing and patient capital. And, we have Nat come and talk about community land trusts, and half the students have never heard of a community land trust when they arrive in planning school and in architecture school. But now we're getting really serious interest in these sorts of questions and these pathways. So it's encouraging.
Go ahead.
In the community where I live, every time there's a shopping mall that's like, and proposals to put in 3 or 4 low housing, or the seniors in the community will have townhouses and more debts. Every single time, surrounding community is all they essentially petition it, and the councillors who provide statements, they look at it next time around, they provide that. So how do we balance the democratic process, and how can we enable municipal governments to be able to speak more effectively to the need for intensification? Because everybody wants there, wants cheaper housing. Right? That example where now there's a dozen $1.2 million homes instead of 24 townhouses.
I don't know if that's going to be rude, sorry, Dawn, but I feel like first and foremost, I feel like most elected officials are not necessarily educated into the finances of a city and how that might affect the needs of the community. Like, once you go into office, you don't have training, and let's say you're elected with a majority government, well, like no one in the team kind of knows how to run, because it's everyone's first time. And so, first of all, there needs to be training for elected officials, and like a need for strong teams with actual expertise in housing and in urban planning and in econ, but that also comes to us as people who work in the defense sector and the rights sector, and to be able to go to them and not just give them a meeting to tell them what we need, but also kind of listen to them and to hear about their issues and give them sometimes they're not going to read a 64-page book, but they might read a 2-pager. And sometimes I feel like that's like a good way of getting their attention, is just giving them the tools in the format that they need. And sometimes I'm annoying and I just send like an email to a random elected official with just like 3 links of things that I find important. And sometimes like you get an answer back and it's pretty fun. So sometimes it's just being a little bit random and having like ambition.
Last word to you, Dan.
I'll say one quick, it's a really excellent point, and it's the one I do a lot of work in suburban space and peri-urban landscapes, and it's sort of the knee-jerk reaction. I think part of the work is what we're trying to do in the BSH Collaborative as well, which is to get a better sense of where people's pain thresholds are in terms of where they perceive there to be bad things happening. And, you know, Alina referred to the title of the piece I did. It's not how dense you make it, it's how you make it dense. There's a lot of bad densification that we've seen out there. And I think the fact that, you know, architects and planners and schools are getting more excited, and private sector building firms are starting to say, let's think about different ways we can do that. We need more stuff on the ground so that people can say, oh, so you're not proposing to build a giant slab that's going to be horrible and it's going to have all these bad things. So it's not, like, it's as though people are reacting to something that they are seeing as the worst case scenario, even if it's modest. So, you know, there's better knowledge that we need as well and I think another factor that works in our favor is that there are a lot of adult children of people who live in neighborhoods like Pointe Claire who are not able to find their way into housing. That's not talk about like our housing minister in Quebec. It's not, they're not able to buy houses and flip them to make their economies. It's that they can't find housing. And I think that starts to, you know, bring it home for a lot of people who are in privileged or comfortable or stable positions, unlike a lot of the, you know, the racialized and otherwise, you know, shortchanged individuals who are so numerous in Canadian society. So it's promising pathway, but there's work to be done on all fronts.
I think that intergenerational argument works, especially if your kids are stuck in your basement, right? So there is a generational conversation about this for sure. One last thing, and then we'll wrap up. I just want to reassure Erica that the robot dog budget has been zeroed out at CMHC. But I did take the board to an AI-powered, believe it or not, I thought this was insane when I first heard about it, but it's an AI-powered robot panelized house building factory that can actually print in about 6 minutes a wall section. It literally tacks it together while you're watching, swings it around like these 2 big robots like you see in a car factory doing capoeira, and then just loading them on a trailer, taking them out to a site, and they can go from a stack of 2x4s to a closed up house in 5 hours and shave $42,000, I think was the last number, off the cost of a townhouse. Per unit was $42,000. So there is a role for innovation, maybe not dogs, but robots as part of the supply answer for both market and non-market. But finally, just join me in thanking Alina, especially for organizing and steering the panel, but also Nat, Ines, Erica, and Nick for sharing their wisdom with us here this afternoon. And the reception is open. Oh, and Alina did put up, if you want to keep in touch with the Balanced Supply of Housing Initiative, you can find it at the QR code there.